Welcome, dear listeners. Tonight we will take a long, unhurried journey into the everyday realities of the ancient world, in particular, how ordinary Romans went to the toilet, sponge by sponge, step by step. It is a simple story, and yet a strangely revealing one, unfolding slowly, in quiet detail, without any need for hurry. If you enjoy these kinds of slow, calming explorations of history, I kindly invite you to support this channel. A gentle tap on the like button helps more people find our little corner of boring history. And if you would like to hear more of these slow stories, told in the same calm, sleepy tone, I would be very grateful if you would consider subscribing. It is the simplest way to stay with us for many more long nights of quiet history. I would also love to know a little about you. From where are you listening tonight? And what time is it where you are? If you feel like sharing, you can write it down in the comments below. Over time, it becomes its own quiet map of listeners from across the world, each one of us listening, resting, drifting, connected through these gentle stories of the past. So now, let us begin. We will move slowly, from the streets of Rome to the stone benches of the public latrines, through water channels and sponges on sticks, and finally, back again to the quiet of home. Nothing here is hurried, nothing here is dramatic. It is simply history, told slowly, with enough detail to let the mind wander and the body relax. Settle in, find a comfortable place, and let the story unfold. The day in Rome often began not with anything dramatic, but with something simple. A small stirring of light, filtering through the cracks in shutters or the spaces between wooden beams, signaled that the night had given way to another morning. The hum of a waking city rose slowly, never all at once. Somewhere in the distance, the creak of a cartwheel marked a baker making deliveries, or perhaps a farmer bringing produce in from the countryside. The muffled voice of a vendor called out, breaking the silence of dawn. Yet, for many ordinary Romans, the first task of the day was not one of commerce or devotion. It was something far more basic. It was the walk to the public latrine. The journey was not rushed. No one hurried to the latrine. It was simply a part of life, as ordinary as breathing or eating. And so, step by step, one would make their way out of their home, whether it was a crowded insula, stacked several stories high, or a smaller dwelling tucked along the narrow side streets. The streets themselves carried their own particular quiet at this hour, though the quiet was never complete. There was always a background murmur in Rome, always the sound of someone stirring, someone working, someone moving. Stone underfoot, uneven and worn from countless footsteps, set the rhythm of the walk. Each step echoed faintly between high walls, where laundry sometimes dangled from balconies, catching the faint light. The air itself was not entirely fresh. It carried the weight of the city. Rome was not a clean place, and the scent of smoke, animals and refuse lingered no matter the hour. At times the smell of baking bread or cooking oil might slip into the air, reminding one of more pleasant moments. But in the quiet walk to the latrine, the awareness of odour was never absent. It did not shock the senses, but rather formed a steady, familiar background. As one walked, there was time to notice the details. A dog stretched lazily in the corner of a courtyard. A child sat on the steps of a doorway, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Water trickled from a fountain, one of the many small public fountains supplied by Rome's aqueducts. Some residents might stop there first, cupping their hands to splash water on their faces, washing away the last remains of sleep before continuing onward. The sound of water was always comforting, a gentle reminder that beneath the surface of the city ran hidden channels of life-giving flow. The journey to the latrine was not only physical but social. Few Romans were ever entirely alone. Neighbours greeted one another with a nod, or perhaps not at all, depending on their mood. Small clusters of people might already be moving in the same direction, silently acknowledging the shared destination without much need for words. Privacy was rare in Rome, and the act of relieving oneself was no exception. The thought of going alone, of hiding away in silence, was foreign to most Romans. And so, the walk itself often carried a quiet companionship. The streets that led to the latrines varied, depending on one's location. In wealthier areas, the paving stones might be better maintained, the walls around more carefully plastered and painted. In the poorer quarters, the streets were narrower, rougher, and more crowded with debris. Yet, no matter the wealth or status, the latrines themselves were public. They were for everyone, and the walk to them was a shared human necessity. Even senators and shopkeepers, farmers and soldiers found themselves treading the same paths when the need arose. As the destination drew closer, the character of the surroundings shifted subtly. The streets widened a little. The smell grew heavier. The faint tang of human waste lingered in the air. Even before the latrine itself came into view, the noise, too, changed. There was the sound of voices, sometimes laughing, sometimes simply murmuring. There was the splash of water, steady and rhythmic. And there was the unmistakable hum of a place designed for one purpose, but never quiet, never empty. The latrine itself might appear unremarkable from the outside. A stone building, simple and practical, perhaps with an arched entrance. The exterior was plain, blending into the architecture of the street. It was not designed to draw attention, and yet, for those making the walk, it marked the end of the short but steady journey. The building stood as a reminder of Rome's practicality, its willingness to take even the most basic aspects of life and turn them into communal, structured experiences. The approach slowed naturally. People adjusted their tunics, shifted the weight of their sandals, and prepared themselves for the transition from street to stone bench. There was no ceremony to it. It was simply life. The walk to the latrine was neither exciting nor dreadful. It was ordinary, woven into the rhythm of daily existence, a small but constant thread in the fabric of Roman urban life. As the first foot crossed the threshold, the sense of quiet from the streets gave way to something different. The echoes inside were louder, bouncing off stone walls and tiled floors. Voices mixed with the splash of water channels, footsteps on stone, and the shifting of garments. The transition marked the end of the walk and the beginning of another phase of the experience. Yet even here, in this most unglamorous of destinations, the walk itself remained in memory. The uneven stones underfoot, the smells of the city, the simple ordinariness of a daily necessity. And so the quiet walk to the latrine ended not with any flourish or conclusion, but with a step into another space, another shared experience, where the practical and the social met in the most basic act of human life. The walk was not dramatic, not memorable, and yet it was repeated countless times by countless people. It was one of those small, invisible moments that held the city together, sponge by sponge, step by step, day after day. Stepping into the Roman latrine was, above all, a shift in atmosphere. The walk along the street brought with it the sounds of footsteps on stone, the movement of carts, and the murmur of voices carried on the open air. But the moment one crossed the threshold into the public latrine, the world altered in subtle ways. The space inside was enclosed, even when open to the air above. The walls gathered sound, holding it in echoes that lingered longer than they would outside. The chatter of voices multiplied in volume, bouncing from stone to stone, mingling with the steady trickle of water that flowed endlessly beneath and around the benches. The air changed too. What had been the mixed smells of the Roman street of smoke, bread, animals and dust gave way to a heavier scent, one that belonged to this place alone. It was not a sudden assault, but a steady presence. something unavoidable yet familiar to all who entered. The benches were the most striking feature. Rows of smooth stone or marble, lined carefully along the walls or set across from one another, invited visitors to sit. Each bench was pierced by rounded openings, evenly spaced, cut with care. They were not designed for comfort, but for durability, for repetition, for countless bodies passing through day after day. Beneath the benches ran shallow channels of water, carrying waste away into the unseen depths of the sewer system. Another smaller stream flowed in front of the seats, within easy reach, ready to rinse the sponges that served in place of paper. The sound of this water was constant, a soft and liquid counterpoint to the voices above. The light within a latrine varied. Some were partly open to the sky, letting in a soft shaft of daylight, broken by shadows that fell across the stone. Others were dimmer, lit by torches or small oil lamps, their flames flickering gently, casting wavering shapes upon the walls. In both cases, the light was secondary. It was enough to see, but never enough to make the space feel bright. The dimness gave the latrine a muted quality, slowing down every movement, softening the outlines of those present. Privacy was absent. To enter a latrine was to share a space with others. People sat side by side, often no more than a few feet apart, their tunics lifted or adjusted, their bodies engaged in the most basic act of life. And yet, for Romans, this lack of privacy was not cause for shame. It was simply the way of things. To enter a latrine was to join a small society, temporary but constant, where the boundaries between the public and the personal blurred. Men might talk to one another as they Saturday, friends might exchange gossip, strangers might offer a word of complaint about the weather or the quality of the bread that morning. Some spoke, some sat silently. The choice was left to each, but the closeness remained, unbroken. The noises filled the space with their own rhythm. There was the shifting of feet against stone floors, the brushing of garments as tunics were moved and adjusted, the clink of a sandal buckle, or the soft scratch of wood against stone. Over all of it lay the ever-present trickle of water, steady, gentle, and enduring. It carried with it a sense of continuity, a reminder that this process was unending, that the latrine served not one person, not one group, but the entire flow of life in the city. It was a hum that never ceased, day or night, a low undercurrent that tied each visit together. One might pause, for a moment, to take in the details. The benches worn smooth by centuries of use, the stone edges rounded slightly by the passage of time and countless bodies pressing against them, the faint marks of tools still visible where masons had cut the seats, the dampness of the floors, where water had spilled or splashed, the tiny bits of debris, swept here by sandals, carried by wind, left by habit. Every corner spoke of use, of repetition, of an endless cycle of entry and exit, of sitting and rising. The act of entering was not hurried. Visitors moved with the same steady pace they had on the street. There was no reason for haste, no expectation of speed. The latrine was not a place of drama, but of necessity, and necessity carried its own calm. One found a place, adjusted oneself, and joined the quiet community that already Saturday. It was ordinary, and in its ordinariness lay its own stillness. The smells were ever present, though their strength depended on the place and the hour. Some latrines, well flushed and frequently cleaned, carried only a muted scent, softened by the fresh flow of water. Others, less tended, heavier with use, bore a stronger odour that clung to the air. But for those who entered, the scent was not shocking. It was expected, as natural as the stones beneath their feet. It did not repel so much as remind. Life, in all its forms, left traces behind, and the latrine was where those traces gathered. To a Roman, it was less a source of disgust and more a simple fact. one woven into the fabric of daily life. The sounds of conversation varied. Some spoke softly, voices almost lost beneath the echo of stone and water. Others spoke louder, laughing or trading jokes. A group of friends might lean together, their words flowing back and forth, passing the time as they Saturday. A solitary visitor might remain silent, eyes lowered, waiting only to finish and move on. Children, too, were sometimes present, their higher voices adding a sharper tone to the murmur of adults. In this shared space, all voices mixed together, forming a steady hum, like the background noise of a marketplace, but slower, calmer, muted by the nature of the place. For a newcomer, perhaps someone from a distant village where such structures did not exist, the sight of the latrine might have been strange. To enter a place where so many sat together, engaged in so private a task, would have felt unusual, perhaps uncomfortable. But for Romans, raised in a city where everything was shared, fountains, baths, streets, temples, it was simply another extension of communal life. The latrine was not hidden away. It stood open, available, practical. It was part of the order of the city, as essential as the forum or the market. Even the architecture reflected this practicality. The benches were aligned with care, the water channels laid out with precision. The Romans, who built roads that stretched for miles and aqueducts that carried water across valleys, applied the same attention to their latrines. They were not crude, but designed. They were not hidden, but present. And though the purpose was plain, the thought behind them was complex. To enter a latrine was to enter not only a space of necessity, but also a space of engineering, of planning, of deliberate construction. The act of crossing the threshold, of moving from the open street into the enclosed latrine, was thus more than physical. It was a shift into a different rhythm, a different tempo of life. Outside, the city bustled, with carts rolling, vendors shouting, and children running. Inside, the pace slowed, the movement steadied. There was no rush, no urgency. Time seemed to stretch, to linger. The water flowed at its own pace. The voices rose and fell gently, and the air carried the weight of routine. To enter the latrine was to join something larger than oneself. Each visitor became part of a pattern, part of the endless repetition of life in Rome. The benches filled and emptied, the water flowed, the sounds echoed, and then faded, only to be replaced again. And so the cycle continued, unbroken, unremarkable, yet deeply constant. It was in this constancy, in this steady rhythm, that the true character of the Roman latrine revealed itself. It was not a place of surprise, but of sameness. Each visit mirrored the last. Each step into the space carried the memory of countless others who had walked the same path. And so, the entrance into the public latrine was not dramatic, not memorable in any singular sense. It was ordinary, it was familiar, it was expected. Yet in that very ordinariness lay its power. It was a space where the most human of needs met, the most Roman of solutions, collective, engineered, and enduring. To step inside was to accept this blend, to become one more voice among the murmurs, one more body among the benches, one more presence in the quiet flow of water and time. To step into the Roman latrine was to accept not only the absence of privacy but the presence of company. It was a place where necessity and society overlapped, where the act of relieving oneself became a shared experience, woven into the larger fabric of daily life. The benches were never far apart. One person sat within easy reach of another, their bodies close enough that a whispered word could be heard without strain. And so, while the purpose of the room was simple, the reality of its use was far more layered. It was not only a place for the body, but also a place for the voice, for the exchange of words, for the subtle weaving of social threads. Conversations here were rarely profound, yet they carried their own weight. Two men might discuss the weather, remarking on the heat of summer or the chill of winter. A pair of women might comment on the rising price of grain, their voices low but steady. Friends could gossip about a neighbour's habits, about who was seen entering which doorway the night before, or about which vendor had the freshest olives in the market that morning. The topics were ordinary, unremarkable, but they filled the air with a steady hum, a sound that made the space feel alive, communal, shared. There was, too, a strange levelling effect in the latrine. Senators and shopkeepers, soldiers and labourers all might sit side by side upon the same benches. The differences in wealth and status did not vanish entirely, but they softened. In the act of sitting together, engaged in the same task, the sharp edges of hierarchy blurred. No matter the grandeur of one's home or the simplicity of one's room in an insula, the latrine reduced all to the same human condition, and in that condition, words passed more easily, barriers lowered, the ordinary replaced the extraordinary. The latrine became, in this way, a kind of informal meeting place. Deals might be whispered between merchants, their voices dropping as they leaned close. Rumours could spread quickly, carried from one mouth to another, borne on the echoing walls to ears that were never far away. Small alliances formed here, not in the grand halls of politics, but in the simple space of shared benches. A favour might be asked, a promise given, all while the water trickled steadily beneath their feet. Yet not all words were spoken aloud. Silence had its own presence in the latrine. Some visitors preferred to sit quietly, their gaze fixed on the stone before them, their thoughts wandering elsewhere. And in that silence, too, there was a form of companionship. To sit among others, without words, was still to share in their presence. The quiet was not empty but full of the subtle sounds of bodies shifting, of water flowing, of sandals scraping against stone. Even in silence, the latrine was never solitary. The social side of the latrine extended beyond conversation. It was found in gestures, in the passing of a sponge, in the sharing of water, in the simple acknowledgement of another's presence. A nod, a faint smile, a glance exchanged, these were small acts, yet they carried meaning. They reminded each visitor that they were part of something larger, part of a community that encompassed all of Rome. The latrine was not merely a place of function, but a reminder of shared humanity, of the ways in which lives intersected in the most ordinary of places. Children, too, sometimes entered the space with their parents. Their higher voices carried more clearly in the echoing room, adding a sharper tone to the deeper murmur of adult speech. A child might ask a question, prompting soft laughter from those nearby. Another might fidget, restless, their small feet tapping against the stone. In these moments, the continuity of life was evident. The old and the young, the experienced and the new, all gathered in one place, bound together by a necessity that spared no age. For the Romans, the absence of privacy was not the intrusion it might seem to modern minds. To them, it was simply the way of things. Baths were public, streets were crowded, meals were shared. The body was not hidden away, but lived in community, exposed to the eyes and ears of others. And so the latrine, far from being a place of shame, was merely another expression of that communal life. It was an extension of the Roman understanding that the individual was always part of the collective, that no act existed in complete isolation. There were, of course, moments of discomfort. Not every conversation was welcome, not every presence was pleasant. Yet even these moments were absorbed into the larger rhythm of the latrine. The room was not designed for solitude. Its benches and channels made clear that it was a space of togetherness. One accepted this, as one accepted the noise of the forum or the press of bodies in the baths. To resist it was futile. To embrace it was natural. The rhythm of social life in the latrine had its own pace. Words rose and fell gently. Laughter broke out and then faded. Silence settled. and was replaced by the next murmur of speech. Time seemed to slow here, stretched out by the ordinariness of the task at hand. No one hurried their words, for there was nowhere else to be. The water flowed at its own pace, unhurried, steady, and the conversations mirrored it, slow, calm, unremarkable, yet enduring. One could imagine the way a story might spread in this setting. A whisper about a magistrate's decision, spoken softly in one corner, might be carried by another to the marketplace, and from there to the baths, and from there to the tavern. In this way, the latrine was not only a place of necessity, but a node in the network of Roman communication. It was a place where information flowed as steadily as the water beneath the benches, trickling from mouth to mouth, pooling in the minds of many, carried onward by the current of daily life. The latrine also offered a curious form of equality in discomfort. All sat upon the same hard stone, all shared in the same scents, the same sounds, the same lack of privacy. This shared experience, while never celebrated, bound people together in a subtle way. It reminded each person that no matter their status, they were still part of the same cycle, subject to the same needs. And in that reminder lay a quiet humility, a grounding in the simplest truths of existence. For some, the latrine was a place of brief respite. To sit, to speak with others, to pause in the flow of the day was in itself a kind of rest. The work of the market, the demands of the workshop, the duties of the household, all were set aside for a few moments. The body found relief, the voice found company, and the mind found a small measure of stillness. The latrine was not a place of beauty nor of pleasure, yet it was a place where the pace of life slowed, where the weight of solitude lifted, where the ordinariness of being human was shared without pretense. In this way, the social side of the latrine was not an addition to its function, but a part of it. The two were inseparable. To relieve oneself was also to enter into community. To sit upon the bench was also to sit among others. To hear the trickle of water was also to hear the murmur of voices. The act itself was never solitary, never detached. It was woven into the life of the city, as integral to its rhythm as the ringing of hammers in a forge or the chanting of prayers in a temple. And so, the Roman latrine stood not only as a structure of stone and water, but as a space of connection. It was humble, it was ordinary, it was unremarkable in its design, yet remarkable in its role. It gathered people together, reduced them to their simplest selves, reminded them of their shared condition, and offered them, if only for a moment, the presence of others. It was not a place to be remembered, yet it was never forgotten, for it was part of the daily fabric of life, woven quietly, consistently, into the pattern of existence. The social side of the latrine was, above all, gentle. It was not loud, not grand, not dramatic. It was a hum, a murmur, a steady undercurrent that carried people along. It was the sound of words spoken without urgency, of laughter shared without intensity, of silence kept without discomfort. It was ordinary, and in its ordinariness, it was soothing. To sit among others, to share in this most basic act, was to find oneself part of something larger, something constant, something enduring. And in that constancy lay a strange comfort, a reminder that life, no matter its differences, always returned to the same quiet necessities, shared sponge by sponge. Day by day, in the world of ancient Rome, even the most ordinary object could take on a place of quiet significance. Among the stone benches of the latrine, among the trickling water and the echo of voices, there existed one such object, humble yet essential, the tursorium, the sponge on a stick. To speak of Roman toilets is inevitably to speak of this small companion, this unassuming tool that bridged the gap between the body and its relief. It was simple in design, practical in purpose, and yet it reveals much about how the Romans understood cleanliness, community, and the shared rituals of daily life. The tussorium was fashioned with practicality in mind. A wooden handle, sometimes short, sometimes longer, held at its end a soft sea sponge, harvested from the waters of the Mediterranean. The sponge was chosen not for beauty, nor for elegance, but for its texture, its ability to absorb, its resilience when rinsed and used again. When attached securely to the handle, it formed a tool both modest and ingenious. Its purpose was clear, and its presence in the latrine was as ordinary to a Roman as soap might be to us today. Placed not upon the benches themselves, but nearby in a gutter of flowing water, or resting in a shallow basin, the sponges awaited their users. They sat half submerged, their porous bodies darkened by dampness, softened by repeated immersion. To the Roman eye, there was nothing unusual in this. The sponge was an object like any other, ready for the next hand to reach, to lift, to use, and then to return to the water once more. It was, in its way, a communal tool. The tussorium was rarely a personal possession, kept only for one's own use. Instead, it was shared, just as the benches were shared, just as the space itself was shared. To modern minds, this may seem uncomfortable, perhaps even unthinkable. Yet, in the rhythm of Roman life, it was simply part of the pattern. Cleanliness was maintained not through avoidance of sharing, but through the ritual of rinsing. After use, the sponge was dipped in the flowing channel of water, swirled gently, pressed clean against the current, and sometimes refreshed with a dash of vinegar or salted water. It was this repeated act of cleansing, steady and habitual, that sustained the tool's place in daily life. The act itself was unhurried. One would reach for the sponge, perhaps feeling the damp coolness of the wood, perhaps pausing for a moment to test the weight of it in the hand. The sponge, saturated with water, was pliant, giving beneath the touch, yielding to the slightest pressure. It was not harsh, not rough, but soft in its contact, and it served its role with quiet efficiency. There was no ceremony in the act, no flourish, simply a steady, practical use, as natural as any other movement in the latrine. When the task was complete, the sponge returned to the water. It sank slightly, dark against the pale current, resting until another hand reached again. And so, the cycle continued, sponge to hand to water, day after day, year after year. Each sponge endured countless such moments, worn slowly by use, softened further with time, its life measured not in days or weeks, but in the quiet repetition of its function. There is a strange intimacy in imagining this cycle, a reminder of the communal nature of Roman existence. The tussorium was not hidden away, not made private. It belonged to the space, to all who entered it. The idea of a shared tool, touched by many, rinsed by many, accepted by all, spoke to a world where individual ownership was less emphasized in certain realms of life, where community carried the weight of necessity. To be Roman was to share, to participate in the public life of the city, and even here, in the latrine, that truth revealed itself. The Romans, of course, valued cleanliness. The baths stood as testaments to their devotion to washing, to the ritual of water and the renewal it offered. The sponge, in this sense, was simply a smaller expression of the same devotion. It was not luxury, but necessity, not indulgence, but routine. The water that flowed beneath the benches served not only to carry waste away, but to cleanse the sponge, to make it ready again, to ensure that each user might find it in a state of freshness. The flow of water and the act of rinsing combined into a ritual of hygiene, quiet and steady, unremarkable but essential. To consider the tessorium is also to consider the sea from which the sponge was drawn. Sponges were gathered from the depths of the Mediterranean, divers plunging into the water, prying the creatures from rocks, bringing them to the surface. Once dried, once prepared, they found new purpose in the cities, far from the waves that had nurtured them. They travelled from sea to land, from natural form to human tool, their porous bodies transformed into implements of daily necessity. Thus, even in the latrine, the presence of the wider world could be felt, the connection of Rome to the sea, the reach of its commerce, the integration of nature into the routines of the city. The sponge on a stick may seem humble, but in its ordinariness lay a quiet ingenuity. The Romans did not shy away from addressing the needs of the body. They found solutions, practical and effective, and wove them seamlessly into the fabric of daily life. The tessorium was one such solution, simple, effective, enduring. It carried with it no grandeur, no ornament, but it met the need directly, and it did so in a way that could be repeated endlessly, without waste, without excess. The communal nature of the sponge also reflected something deeper about Roman thought. The body was not seen as separate from the community, but as part of it. To share in the use of the sponge was not to lose dignity, but to participate in the larger whole. The presence of vinegar or salt water, sometimes kept nearby for cleansing, was a reminder that hygiene could be maintained through simple means, that order could be kept even in the most ordinary of acts. There were, no doubt, moments of discomfort, of hesitation, yet these too became part of the rhythm. One accepted the sponge as one accepted the bench, as one accepted the flowing water, as one accepted the presence of others. It was the way of life, the way of Rome, a pattern repeated without question, woven into the endless cycles of the day. The tessorium reminds us too of the slowness of Roman life in certain respects. Though their empire stretched wide, though their roads carried legions, and their aqueducts carried water, the details of daily living often unfolded with patience, with repetition, with steadiness. The sponge, dipped, used, rinsed, and returned, embodied that rhythm. It was a small act, yet one performed countless times, each moment adding to the quiet continuity of Roman existence. In the stillness of the latrine, among the soft murmur of voices and the steady trickle of water, the sponge played its role silently. It did not draw attention to itself. It did not carry weight beyond its purpose. And yet, without it, the space would have been incomplete, the routine disrupted. It was small, but it was necessary. It was humble, but it was indispensable. And in that balance, it reveals the heart of Roman daily life, the blending of practicality with community, the weaving together of individual need with collective provision. Even now, when we picture the sponge resting in the water, we might sense the calm of that moment. The stone benches stand firm, the walls echo softly, the air carries the mingling scents of water and stone. The sponge lies in its place, darkened by dampness, waiting. It does not hurry, does not resist, does not call attention. It simply rests until it is lifted again, pressed into service again, returned again. In that repetition lies a kind of quiet meditation, a reminder of the steady cycles that shape human life. And so, the tessorium, the sponge on a stick, endures not only as an object of curiosity, but as a symbol of Roman life in its most ordinary form. It was not grand, it was not celebrated, but it was present, reliable, constant. It belonged to all, it served all, and it revealed, in its quiet way, the communal heart of the Roman world. To imagine it is to imagine the rhythm of the latrine itself, slow, steady, ordinary, shared a rhythm measured not in grandeur, but but in the simple touch of sponge to water, sponge to hand, sponge returned again. To step inside a Roman latrine was to step into a world quietly shaped by water. It was not only stone and sponge that defined the experience, but the ever-present trickle, the soft, persistent flow that moved beneath the benches and carried away what was left behind. In the Roman imagination, water was not simply a necessity for thirst or bathing, but a force that structured daily life, a companion that worked silently in the background. And so, even here, in the most unassuming of places, water gave shape to ritual, to cleanliness, and to the steady rhythm of sanitation. Beneath the stone seats of the latrine, channels were carved with care, their shallow troughs lined with smooth masonry. Into these channels, water was guided, often brought from aqueducts or local springs, directed with quiet precision. The streams were rarely fast or forceful. They did not rush but flowed gently, a steady current that continued hour after hour, day after day. This constancy was their strength. They carried waste away not with violence, but with patience, letting the movement of time itself serve as the cleansing hand. To hear this water was to be reminded of its presence. The soft sound of trickling echoed faintly against the stone walls, mingling with the murmur of voices and the shifting of sandals. It was not a loud sound, not one that demanded attention, but it filled the space, a background music to the act of sitting and waiting. The water was always there, always moving, and in its steadiness, it offered reassurance. The latrine was not stagnant, not still. It was alive with flow, with motion, with the gentle work of sanitation. The Romans understood the value of this movement. Without it, the latrine would have been unbearable. The air heavy, the benches unused. With it, however, the space became not only tolerable but ordinary, woven into the daily life of the city. The water gave the room its rhythm, sweeping away what was left, cleansing the sponge, refreshing the air. It was the quiet worker, uncelebrated but essential, never resting, never ceasing, always carrying out its task. In some latrines, the water was divided into two flows. One stream passed directly beneath the benches, washing away what was deposited. Another, smaller channel ran at the feet of the sitters, offering a place where the sponge could be rinsed. Here, the water was clear, separate from the darker flow, a reminder that sanitation was not a single act but a series of small, deliberate movements. Each current served its own role, each worked in tandem, and together they created a system that was simple yet effective, modest yet ingenious. To imagine this arrangement is to see the care with which the Romans approached their engineering. Stone channels, precisely angled, ensured that the water never pooled, never stagnated, but flowed continuously. The gradient was slight, barely perceptible to the eye, yet it was enough to keep the current alive. The water needed no force beyond gravity, no intervention beyond design. It was the quiet mastery of Roman building, the ability to shape stone and water so that they worked together in unbroken harmony. And this harmony extended beyond the walls of the latrine itself. The waste carried away by the channels did not vanish, but joined larger sewers, the most famous of which was the Cloaca Maxima, the great drain of Rome. There, in vast tunnels beneath the city, water flowed more strongly, sweeping away the collected refuse of thousands. The latrine was thus connected to the greater body of the city's sanitation. Each small channel, a tributary feeding into the larger stream, each trickle joining the greater current. The Cloaca Maxima was itself a marvel, a structure as old as the city, older even than many of its temples and forums. Its wide stone arches, its dark, cool chambers carried water through the hidden veins of Rome. It was unseen by most, uncelebrated in poetry or song, yet it made the life of the city possible. The latrine was but one part of its network, one small entrance into the vast undercurrent that sustained Rome's health. To sit upon the bench was to be connected, however quietly, to that grander system, to the slow, unending work of water beneath the earth. In this way, sanitation was both intimate and expansive. It was the rinsing of a sponge in a shallow channel, and it was the carrying of waste to the distant river. It was the small flow beneath the feet of one person, and it was the great current beneath the feet of thousands. The Romans, perhaps without conscious thought, lived within this web of water, dependent upon its constancy, assured by its presence, relieved by its steady flow. Cleanliness, for them, was not only the removal of dirt but the presence of water itself. To rinse, to bathe, to wash, these were acts of renewal, acts that joined the body to the flow of nature. In the latrine, this renewal was modest, quiet, without grandeur, yet it was still renewal. The sponge, when rinsed, regained its softness. The channel, when flowing, regained its freshness. The space, when cleared, regained its ordinariness. It was not dramatic, but it was steady. It was not celebrated, but it was trusted. The latrine, then, was not a place of stillness, but of cycles. Each visitor came, sat, used the sponge, rinsed it, and departed, leaving the water to continue its work. The benches filled and emptied, the sponges darkened and lightened, the channels carried and cleansed. The cycle repeated, unbroken, unhurried, until it became less an act than a rhythm, less a function than a flow. And in that flow, the Romans found not only sanitation but a kind of order, a reminder that even the smallest necessities of life could be governed by steady design. There was a simplicity in this, yet also a depth. For water, in Roman thought, was not only practical but sacred. Springs were places of worship, rivers were given to gods, fountains were adorned with offerings. The aqueducts that spanned valleys and entered cities were not merely conduits of utility, but triumphs of civilization, celebrated as symbols of Roman mastery over nature. And yet, this same water, that same element, found its way to the latrine, serving without complaint, flowing without pause, fulfilling the most humble of tasks. It was both exalted and ordinary, divine and practical, worshipped and used. To picture the latrine without its water is to imagine silence where there should be sound, stillness where there should be motion, staleness where there should be freshness. It would not be the same place. The presence of water gave it life, gave it continuity, gave it meaning. It made the latrine not only functional but bearable, not only ordinary but integrated into the wider world of Roman existence. The water bound it to the city, to the earth, to the cycles of nature. And so, as one sat upon the bench, one became part of that cycle. The body was relieved, the sponge was rinsed, the water carried all onward. Nothing was final, nothing was stagnant. Everything was in motion, everything was connected, everything flowed. The latrine was thus not only a place of necessity, but a place of reflection, a place where the smallest acts mirrored the greatest truths, that life, like water, is always moving, always renewing, always carrying forward what has been left behind. In the end, the water was not noticed, not spoken of, not praised. It was simply there, always, quietly, steadily. It was the unseen companion of every visitor, the soft sound beneath every word, the hidden worker beneath every bench. To those who entered, it asked for nothing, it offered everything. And when they left, it continued on, unbroken, unhurried, flowing into the unseen darkness of the sewers, flowing into the wider life of the city, flowing endlessly, as it had before, as it would again. When one imagines a Roman latrine, it is tempting to think only of the stone benches, the water channels, the shared sponges. Yet the true reality of such a place was shaped not merely by what could be seen, but by what could be smelled, what could be heard, and what could be felt in the air. These small, constant details made up the atmosphere of the latrine, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, unavoidable, and part of the fabric of daily life. To step inside was to enter into a world of sensory impressions, each quiet, each ordinary, each reminding the visitor of where they were and what they shared with others. The first impression, for many, would have been the scent. The air in a Roman latrine was rarely clean, rarely fresh. Even with the constant flow of water beneath the benches, even with ventilation through windows or open walls, there lingered an odour that could not be erased entirely. It was not sharp, not sudden, but it was steady, a background presence that hung in the room. The mingling of human waste, damp stone, and the faint tang of vinegar used for cleansing created a smell both earthy and sour, heavy yet tolerable to those who visited often. Over time, the regular visitor might cease to notice it fully, their senses dulling to its presence, accepting it as one accepts the dust of a road or the smoke of a hearth. There were, too, the faint scents of the wider world that drifted in. A breeze through an opening might carry the smell of wet earth after rain, or the faint smoke of fires burning in nearby homes. If the latrine stood near a marketplace, one might catch the trace of fish, or the sweetness of fruit, blending awkwardly with the odours within. These scents did not cancel one another, but layered upon one another, creating an atmosphere that was complex, shifting, always slightly different, yet always unmistakably tied to the place. Alongside the smells, there were the sounds. The latrine was not silent, nor was it filled with loudness. It carried instead a steady background of gentle, ordinary noises. The trickle of water was constant, the quiet movement of currents beneath the benches and in the rinsing channels. This sound formed a kind of bass, a rhythm that underpinned everything else, soft and reassuring in its steadiness. Upon it, the voices of those who sat mingled low conversations, brief exchanges, small bursts of laughter, or long stretches of silence broken only by the shifting of feet. The echo of the stone walls shaped these sounds. A voice carried further than it might outdoors, softened, and blurred as it bounced against the hard surfaces. A cough might linger for a moment longer, a laugh might seem fuller, a whisper might travel more clearly than expected. The latrine, though modest, had its own acoustics, creating a soundscape unlike any other place in the city. Visitors grew accustomed to it, learning how to pitch their voices, how to recognize the distance of another by the quality of the sound. There were also the softer, more personal noises, the scrape of sandals across the stone floor, the faint creak of a bench under shifting weight, the splash of water as a sponge was rinsed and returned. These small sounds punctuated the air, unremarkable on their own, but together forming the texture of the room. To sit there was to be surrounded by a chorus of tiny, ordinary noises, each one grounding, each one part of the shared rhythm of the place. Beyond smell and sound, there was the feel of the air itself. Roman latrines were often cool, their stone construction holding the chill of shade even in summer. The dampness of the water added to this coolness, making the air heavy with moisture. In winter, the chill could be biting, sinking into the skin, seeping into the body as one sat upon the stone bench. In summer, the air could grow close and humid, the combination of heat and odour pressing gently upon those within. Yet in all seasons, the air was part of the reality, neither unbearable nor inviting, simply another layer of the sensory world one entered. Light, too, shaped the daily reality of the latrine. Few were brightly lit. Instead, sunlight entered through narrow openings, falling in soft shafts upon the stone. In some places, the light shifted as the day passed, moving slowly across the benches, marking the hours without a clock. At night, torches or small oil lamps might be placed near the entrances, their glow flickering against the walls, their smoke adding to the sense of the space. Light was always partial, always subdued, never filling the room fully but offering just enough to see, just enough to move. Taken together, these impressions, the smell, the sound, the feel, the light, created a world both ordinary and distinctive. No one expected freshness or beauty in such a place. Yet for the Romans, it was not a place of horror or disgust. It was a place of necessity, and necessity softened the edge of discomfort. The smells became background, the sounds became normal, the dampness became familiar. Visitors accepted the reality as it was, neither questioning nor resisting, but folding it into the larger rhythm of daily life. Children, who grew up in the city, would have known these impressions from an early age. Accompanying their parents, listening to the sounds, noticing the smells. For them, the latrine would not have been strange, but simply another part of the city's world, as familiar as the marketplace or the baths. Soldiers, too, accustomed to shared life in camps, would not have found the experience unusual. Travellers, arriving from smaller towns, might find it overwhelming at first, but in time, they too would accept it, adjust to it, let it become ordinary. There were, no doubt, days when the smell grew stronger, when the flow of water slowed, when the air felt heavier, and yet, even then, life continued. People entered, sat, spoke, rinsed the sponge, and departed. The latrine did not close, did not pause. It remained part of the city's fabric. Its reality endured because it was needed. The discomfort was never enough to outweigh the necessity, never enough to make the space unused. In a way, this daily reality reflected the larger truth of Roman life. The city was not free of smells, not free of noise, not free of discomfort. Streets carried the scent of animals, workshops rang with hammers, crowds pressed close in the forum. Life was dense, full, immediate. The latrine was simply one thread in this fabric, one space among many where the senses were filled, where the body was reminded of its place within the community. It was neither better nor worse than the rest, simply different, simply its own. For the modern imagination, the idea of such a place may seem strange, even unpleasant, but for the Romans, it was simply part of living. They did not demand silence where there was noise, or fragrance where there was odour, or privacy where there was community. They accepted the world as it was, filled with sensations, some gentle, some harsh, all part of existence. And in that acceptance lay a kind of peace, a kind of steady rhythm that made the daily reality bearable, even soothing, in its constancy. In the end, the smells and sounds of the latrine were not distractions but reminders. They reminded those who entered that they were human, that they were part of a community, that life was shared in its necessities as well as in its triumphs. They reminded them that cleanliness was a process, not a state, that relief was found not in perfection but in repetition. Each scent, each sound, each feeling of cool air or damp stone was part of the cycle, part of the shared experience of living in Rome. And so, to sit in the latrine was to sit not only among stone and water, but among smells and sounds, among the daily realities that shaped Roman life. It was to be reminded that life was not always fresh, not always silent, not always comfortable, but always shared, always ordinary, always human. The latrine was not remarkable, yet it was unforgettable, for it carried within its air and its echoes the essence of what it meant to live together in the ancient world. When we think of toilets in ancient Rome, the first image that comes to mind is often the public latrine, long rows of stone benches, the flow of water beneath, the murmur of conversation. Yet not all toilets were public, and not all Romans experienced this aspect of life in the same way. Toilets could be found in other places too, in private homes, in small roadside inns, and even in the great complexes of Roman bathhouses. Each of these spaces had its own atmosphere, its own rhythms, its own quiet details that shaped how people encountered one of the most ordinary yet necessary parts of daily existence. In a Roman home, the toilet was rarely the grandest of features. Unlike the decorated atrium, with its pool of water to catch the rain, or the dining room where guests reclined on couches, the toilet was usually tucked away, small and unobtrusive. Sometimes it was positioned near the kitchen, sometimes near the back of the house, sometimes even just off the courtyard. The placement was practical more than anything else, designed to take advantage of existing drains or cesspits. It was not a room to display wealth or taste, but a quiet, functional corner of the household, one that most visitors would never see. The design of these household toilets was simple. A single seat, often made of wood or stone, would be set above a pit or connected to a drain. The drain might link to a larger sewer if the house was fortunate enough to stand along one of the city's main channels, or it might lead to a smaller cesspit, emptied only when full. A small water channel might run nearby if plumbing was present, but in many houses there was little more than the seat itself and the space beneath. Privacy was greater than in the public latrine, but the scale was smaller, the arrangements more basic. The smells of these private toilets were different too. Without the constant flow of water and the shared use of vinegar or sponges, the odour could be stronger, lingering longer within the enclosed walls of the house. Yet in another sense, it was less overwhelming, for the space was smaller, the use less frequent, and the family accustomed to it. What might have seemed unpleasant to an outsider was simply part of the household rhythm, accepted without remark, much as one accepted the smoke of the kitchen fire or the dust of the street. Sound in such a place was minimal. Unlike the public latrine, where voices mingled and water trickled, the home toilet was quiet. One might hear the faint creak of the door, the soft shifting of wood against stone, the muffled noises from the household beyond the wall. A child might call from the courtyard, a servant might pass by carrying a tray, a neighbour's voice might drift faintly through the air. Yet inside, the space was subdued, private, hushed. It was not silent, but its sounds were gentle, part of the broader murmur of household life. Inns offered a different experience. These small establishments, scattered along Roman roads and clustered within towns, served travellers of all kinds. Merchants, soldiers, messengers, and pilgrims might all find themselves staying in the same space, eating simple meals, sleeping in shared rooms, and, of course, needing the same basic facilities. The toilet of an inn was rarely elaborate. Sometimes it was little more than a pit dug near the back. Sometimes a small room with a bench and a drain, sometimes a communal latrine on a smaller scale than those found in cities. For the traveller, such places were practical rather than comfortable. The smell was stronger, the upkeep less regular, the water less abundant. Yet necessity guided the use. To journey along Roman roads meant long days of walking, riding, or carrying loads. To reach an inn at day's end was to find shelter, food, and relief. The toilet, humble though it was, played its part in this small comfort. The traveller entered, endured the brief odour, performed the ordinary act, and returned to the courtyard or the common room, where lamps flickered and voices murmured. The sounds of an inn's toilet reflected the life of the place. One might hear the clatter of hooves outside, the bark of a dog tied near the gate, the laughter of men drinking wine in the next room. The noises were less softened, more immediate, carrying the energy of movement and travel. Unlike the public latrine, with its steady water and quiet echoes, the inn's toilet was closer to the world, its atmosphere more restless, shaped by the coming and going of strangers. Yet it was still part of the rhythm of the road, another thread in the fabric of travel. And then there were the bathhouses, among the most distinctive features of Roman life. These vast complexes, where people came not only to wash but to socialize, to exercise, to read, and to relax, also contained toilets. For the Romans, cleanliness was not a single act but a sequence of rituals, and the toilet was one small step in the broader process of tending to the body. In the bathhouse, the toilet was neither hidden nor emphasized, but simply one more facility among many, another space provided for necessity. These toilets were often closer in design to the public latrine, with benches, water channels, and multiple seats. They were communal, though on a smaller scale, and they carried the same mingling of voices, the same gentle background of flowing water, yet their place within the bathhouse lent them a different character. Visitors might come to the toilet after a session in the hot room, their skin still warm, their bodies relaxed. They might pause there before entering the cold pool, their thoughts already to turn to the next stage of the ritual. The toilet was part of a journey through the building, woven into the sequence of movement from one room to the next. The atmosphere of the bathhouse toilet was shaped by its surroundings. The smell of sweat and oil drifted in from the exercise courts, blending with the odour of waste and water. The sounds of splashing and conversation from nearby rooms carried faintly through the walls. The air was warmer, humid with steam, touched by the faint scent of burning charcoal from the furnaces that heated the baths. To sit there was to be reminded not only of necessity, but of leisure, not only of the body's needs, but of its rituals. In all of these places, the home, the inn, the bathhouse, the toilet played a role both ordinary and essential. Each space was shaped by its context. Each carried its own atmosphere, its own sensory details. The private home offered quiet and familiarity. The inn offered practicality and transience. The bathhouse offered a communal stop along a longer ritual. None were glamorous, none were celebrated, yet all were part of the rhythm of life. For the Romans, the presence of toilets in so many different places reflected a larger truth, that life was communal, practical, and embodied. They accepted that necessity travelled with them, that the body's needs followed them from home to road, from rest to leisure. They did not separate the toilet from the rest of life, but wove it into the fabric, modest yet constant, as natural as breathing or eating. The modern mind may find it strange to imagine these spaces, to picture the small rooms tucked into houses, the humble corners of inns, the warm, damp chambers of bathhouses. Yet for the Romans, they were simply there, as much a part of life as the street outside, the market stall, or the temple steps. They were places not of drama, but of routine, not of spectacle, but of constancy. They offered relief, they offered continuity, and they reminded those who entered that life, however complex, was always grounded in the simplest of needs. And so, whether one was a wealthy homeowner in a villa, a weary traveller on a dusty road, or a citizen stepping into the baths after a day's work, the experience was shared, different in scale, different in detail, but united in essence. A seat, a pit, a channel, an odour, a brief pause in the rhythm of the day. To enter such a place was to be reminded of humanity's sameness, of the ordinary reality that bound all together. It was not dramatic, it was not glamorous, but it was real. And in its quiet way, it was enduring. Toilets in ancient Rome were not only practical spaces, but also places that carried quiet associations of health, of belief, and of unseen influences. For the Romans, The body was not simply a collection of organs or functions, it was part of a wider balance that tied human life to nature, to the gods, and to the mysteries that lay beyond everyday understanding. The latrine, as a place where the body's hidden processes became visible, was inevitably linked to concerns about well-being, to thoughts about the unseen forces of disease, and to small acts of superstition intended to keep danger at bay. The Roman sense of health was not built upon modern notions of germs or bacteria. Instead, it was shaped by the theories of humours, of balance, of flows within the body that needed to be maintained. Waste was seen as part of this process, an element that needed to leave in order for balance to remain. To pass waste was not only an act of relief but also one of health, a sign that the body was working as it should, releasing what was no longer useful. The toilet was therefore not only a place of necessity, but a quiet confirmation of the body's cycles, its regular patterns, its hidden rhythm. Yet at the same time, there was an awareness that toilets could be dangerous places. The very act of gathering people together, of sharing sponges, of sitting side by side in a confined space, carried with it the risk of illness. Though Romans did not speak of microbes, they noticed pattern. They noticed that diseases sometimes spread more easily among those who shared certain spaces. They sensed that foul air, the vapours rising from waste, could bring weakness or fever. They called this miasma a corruption of the air, unseen but powerful, capable of seeping into the body and unsettling its balance. To enter a latrine was therefore to step into a place both necessary and risky. One might breathe the damp air and wonder if it carried illness. One might notice the damp walls, the trickling water, and feel a slight unease. These were not fears spoken loudly, not anxieties that dominated life, but they lingered at the edge of thought, quiet reminders that relief was never entirely without its price. For some, the risk was ignored, softened by habit and necessity. For others, it was acknowledged through small acts of belief, gestures intended to bring a measure of protection. Superstition was never far from Roman life, and the latrine was no exception. In a world filled with gods, spirits, and unseen forces, there was no place entirely outside their reach. Some believed that demons lurked in latrines, drawn by the foulness, waiting to cause harm to the unwary. Stories were told of strange noises, of sudden illness, of shadows that lingered in corners. Whether these were tales to warn children or genuine fears, they reflected a sense that the toilet was not simply physical but also spiritual, a threshold between the safe world of the household and the uncertain world of what lay beneath. Protective charms were sometimes carried. A small amulet, a carved figure, or a word spoken under the breath might be used before entering. Some might mutter a prayer to Fortuna, asking for protection, or to Cloatina, the goddess associated with the sewers and cleanliness. Cloatina's name, derived from the Latin for to clean, linked her to the Great Cloaca Maxima, the city's vast sewer system. She was honoured in Rome with a small shrine, reminding citizens that even the hidden, even the unglamorous, had their divine guardians. To invoke her name was to ask for safety, to acknowledge that even in the latrine, the gods watched. Beliefs about spirits and omens also shaped how people thought of toilets. The sound of rushing water might be taken as a good sign, a reminder of cleansing and renewal. An unexpected noise, a sudden draft, might be seen with more suspicion, a suggestion that unseen forces were stirring. For some, these moments were shrugged off. For others, they became signs to be noted, woven into the fabric of daily superstitions that guided small decisions. Health, too, was tied to the rhythms of the latrine. Physicians of the time wrote about digestion, about the importance of regularity, about the need to avoid either excess or blockage. They recommended diets that would ease the flow, herbs that would soften or strengthen the body's movements. The toilet was, in this way, part of medicine, part of the advice given to those seeking well-being. To sit upon the bench was not merely to relieve oneself, but to participate in the cycle of health, to enact a small ritual of balance within the body. There was also a recognition that illness could be observed through waste. Changes in colour, in consistency, in smell, all carried meaning for physicians. A careful eye might study these signs, reading them as indicators of imbalance, as clues to hidden conditions. For the ordinary Roman, this might not be a subject of close analysis, but for those who tended the sick, the toilet became a place of quiet observation, of learning about the body's inner state through what it left behind. The fears of disease and the habits of superstition did not keep people away. Necessity was stronger, yet they added a layer of awareness, a layer of quiet caution. One entered the latrine not thoughtlessly, but with an unspoken recognition of its double nature. It was at once ordinary and slightly unsettling, necessary and faintly dangerous, familiar and tinged with the unknown. The act of rinsing the sponge, of breathing the air, of sitting side by side all carried with them not only the reality of relief but the shadow of possibility, the sense that something unseen might linger. And yet, these beliefs did not make the latrine a place of dread. Rather, they folded it into the broader tapestry of Roman life, where gods and spirits touched every corner, where health was always a balance to be maintained, where superstition was a gentle companion to daily action. Just as one might whisper a prayer before setting out on a journey, or offer a coin at a shrine before entering the forum, so too one might carry a small charm or murmur a word before entering the toilet. It was not fear so much as respect for the unseen, respect for the body, respect for the delicate balance that sustained life. For the modern mind, these associations may seem strange, even quaint. To think of demons lurking in shadows, of gods guarding sewers, of charms carried into small damp rooms. Yet for the Romans, it was all of a piece. Life was not divided into sacred and profane, into places of belief and places of practicality. All was intertwined. The latrine was both a place of stone and water and a place of spirits and signs. It was both physical and spiritual, both ordinary and touched by mystery. In this way, the Roman approach to toilets reveals something larger about their world. It shows how seamlessly they wove belief into daily life, how naturally they found the divine in the mundane. The latrine was not exempt from this, nor was any other space. To live in Rome was to live surrounded by layers of meaning, some seen, some unseen, all accepted as part of the whole. Health, belief, superstition, these were not separate categories, but threads in a single fabric, binding the body to the city, the individual to the gods, the ordinary act to the mysteries of life. And so, when a Roman sat upon the bench, they did more than relieve themselves. They enacted a small part of a larger rhythm. They participated in the balance of the body. They entered a space touched by unseen forces. They acknowledged, however quietly, the presence of gods and spirits in even the most modest of places. It was not dramatic, not overwhelming, but it was real, and it was constant. A reminder that health was fragile, that belief was near, that superstition was simply another way of living within the unknown. When one thinks of Roman toilets, the image is clear: long stone benches, steady water flowing beneath, and rows of citizens seated together in quiet conversation. Yet Rome was not the whole of the ancient world, nor even the only civilization to consider how best to deal with the body's simplest and most constant need. Beyond Rome, across distant lands and older ages, other peoples also found their own ways, their own rhythms, their own quiet answers to the same question. To look beyond Rome is to see a wide tapestry of practices, some similar, some different, all shaped by local customs, resources, and beliefs. Long before Rome, in the valleys of Mesopotamia, the first cities were already grappling with the question of sanitation. In places like Ur and Babylon, people dug pits for waste, sometimes lining them with clay or stone, sometimes connecting them to small channels that carried wastewater away. These early attempts were modest, yet they reveal a familiar concern to separate what was clean from what was foul, to create a space where necessity could be managed with some measure of order. For the people of these river valleys, the toilet was not elaborate, but it was deliberate, a step toward shaping the environment to fit human life. In ancient Egypt, toilets took another form. Within houses, seats of limestone or wood might be placed above jars filled with sand. These jars could then be emptied, the sand replaced, the cycle begun anew. Here, too, there was little water, for the desert climate did not allow for constant streams to wash waste away. Instead, the Egyptians relied on dryness, on the steady absorption of sand, to handle what the body produced. It was a simple solution, shaped by the land itself, by the scarcity of flowing water, by the abundance of sand at every turn. The Greeks, nearer to Rome in time and culture, had practices that foreshadowed what the Romans themselves would build. In larger Greek cities, drains and channels were laid to carry water, and public facilities existed in some places. Yet even here, privacy was not the norm. Communal spaces were common, simple benches or pits where people sat together, much as they would later in Rome. At the same time, the Greeks had their own solutions for cleansing, often using smooth stones or pieces of pottery instead of the sponge that the Romans favoured. These differences remind us that even when the shape of the toilet was shared, the details varied, each culture developing its own habits within the broad outline of necessity. Farther east, in the lands of the Indus Valley, even earlier systems of sanitation had been devised. Archaeologists at Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa discovered brick-lined drains, carefully constructed, leading away from houses and streets. Toilets were built within homes, connected by these drains, showing a concern not only for the individual but for the community, for the movement of waste away from living spaces. Here was one of the earliest known sewer systems in the world, created thousands of years before Rome, a quiet testament to the ingenuity of people faced with the simplest of challenges. China too had its traditions. In some places, toilets were little more than pits, yet in others, water was used to carry waste away. In agricultural regions, human waste was not always discarded, but often collected, stored, and later used as fertilizer for fields. This practice, sometimes called night soil, tied the toilet directly to the rhythms of farming, linking the body's cycles to the cycles of crops. To relieve oneself was not only to dispose of waste, but also to contribute, however indirectly, to the nourishment of the land. The toilet, in this context, was not only a place of necessity, but a point of connection between human life and the soil itself. In the colder lands of northern Europe, where Rome would one day expand its influence, toilets took humbler forms. Pits dug in the earth, sometimes lined with wood, sometimes covered with simple seats, were the norm. In wooden houses, small chambers might contain buckets or pots, emptied later into fields or ditches. Without the benefit of stone construction, without the constant flow of water that Rome's aqueducts allowed, these solutions remained basic, yet they were functional, adapted to the climate, to the resources, to the rhythms of rural life in forests and villages. The Celts, in their hill forts and settlements, may have used cesspits, while the Germanic tribes, moving through forests and river valleys, relied on the simplest of arrangements. These practices did not carry the grandeur of Rome's public latrines, but they reveal the same truth. that all peoples, in all places, faced the same necessity and answered it as best they could. Beyond Europe and Asia, in the Americas, different traditions arose. Among the Maya, for instance, some evidence suggests that water channels and reservoirs were used not only for drinking and bathing, but perhaps also for carrying away waste. In other places, simple pits and communal spaces sufficed. The details differed, but the underlying concern remained the same: to find a place where the body's needs could be met. Apart from the spaces of living and worship, what unites all these examples is not their sameness but their variety. Each culture responded in its own way, shaped by climate, by resources, by belief. The Egyptians relied on sand, the Chinese on collection and reuse, the Indus Valley on drains and bricks, the Greeks on stones, the Romans on water and sponges. Each solution was practical within its world. Each reflected not only necessity, but the broader patterns of life. The beliefs that surrounded these toilets also varied. Just as Romans feared demons in latrines, other cultures had their own stories. In some traditions, spirits were thought to linger near waste, drawn by the foulness. In others, the act of relieving oneself was considered ritually unclean, requiring purification afterward. In still others, waste was seen not as foul but as useful, a resource to be returned to the soil. These attitudes shaped not only the design of toilets, but also the rituals that surrounded them, the small habits of cleansing, the prayers or charms, the ways people thought about their own bodies. And yet, despite the differences, there is a quiet sameness that runs through all. In every culture, the toilet was modest. It was not the place of feasts, not the place of ceremonies, not the place of display. It was functional, ordinary, often hidden from view. People did not build monuments to their toilets, nor write long praises of them, yet they used them daily, depended on them, and wove them into the fabric of life. The toilet was both invisible and constant, humble and essential, overlooked and indispensable. For the modern listener, to trace this variety is to be reminded of a larger truth, that across time and space, humanity has always shared the same needs. The forms change, the details differ, the materials shift, but the essence remains. Whether in Rome with its stone benches and flowing water, or in Egypt with its sand-filled jars, or in China with its fields nourished by waste, the act is the same, the rhythm the same, the necessity the same. It is one of the threads that ties all peoples together, one of the quiet reminders of our common humanity. The Romans, for all their engineering, for all their aqueducts and sewers, were not unique in facing this challenge. They were part of a longer story, a broader tradition, a human effort that spanned continents and millennia. Their latrines were distinctive, yes, but they were also echoes of older practices and inspirations for later ones. To sit upon a Roman bench was to sit within a tradition as old as civilization itself, a tradition that stretched far beyond the city, far beyond the empire, into the wide world. And so, when we think of Roman toilets, it is worth also thinking of toilets beyond Rome, of pits dug in the earth, of jars filled with sand, of drains lined with brick, of fields enriched by waste. It is worth remembering that necessity is universal, that the simplest of acts binds us across time and culture. Rome gave its own answer, but it was only one among many, one voice in the quiet chorus of human ingenuity, one expression of the endless rhythm of life. In this way, toilets beyond Rome remind us of both difference and sameness. They remind us that culture shapes even the smallest of details, yet also that some needs are shared by all. They remind us that the ordinary, though humble, can reveal connections across vast distances, across long centuries. And they remind us that in every corner of the world, in every age, people paused, sat, and returned, carrying with them the same quiet relief, the same simple continuity of being human. The visit is nearly over. The quiet stone benches, the flowing water, the faint echoes of conversation have been left behind. You rise from your place, perhaps stretching slightly, feeling the weight of the stone walls and the hum of the city outside waiting to greet you once more. There is no rush, no urgency. The Roman latrine has served its purpose, and now, slowly, step by step, the path leads outward again, away from the murmuring interior, back toward the familiar rhythm of life. The air shifts as you cross from one space to another. The cool shade of the interior gives way to the softer warmth of the street. The sounds change too. Inside, there was a mix of dripping water, shifting feet, low voices. Outside, the hum of the city resumes, carts rolling over cobblestones, sandals brushing against the pavement, the faint cry of a vendor calling to passers-by. The latrine is left behind, but it remains part of the quiet texture of the day, one more pause in the long unfolding of hours. As you step forward, the sun catches the edges of buildings. Shadows stretch across the ground, some sharp, some blurred. The light does not dazzle, but it gently illuminates the surfaces. The pale stone of walls, the faint dust in the air, the soft curve of a column. The city is vast, yet each step feels contained, deliberate. You walk at an unhurried pace, carrying with you not only the memory of where you have been, but also the subtle comfort of a need fulfilled. Rome, or any ancient city, does not move quickly. The streets are filled with small details, each worth a glance. A child crouching by a fountain, tracing shapes in the water. A pair of donkeys standing motionless, waiting as their driver adjusts a strap. A woman, leaning from a doorway, speaking softly to someone out of sight. Life unfolds in layers, one action upon another, steady and unhurried. The latrine was part of this life, just as much as the fountain or the doorway or the strap on the donkey's back. Returning home after such a visit is not dramatic, not filled with ceremony. It is simply another walk through the streets, another passage along familiar ground. Yet, in this ordinariness, there is comfort. The toilet is not a grand place, yet it offers relief, and from that relief flows a quiet ease, a readiness to step back into the larger world. The body is lighter, the mind calmer, the path ahead a little smoother. The way home might take you past the market. Stalls lined with baskets of olives, bundles of herbs, loaves of bread stacked in neat rows. The smell of baking drifts into the air, mingling with the sharper scent of fish laid out on damp cloths. People move slowly between the stalls, exchanging words, choosing what they will carry home. None of them think much about toilets in this moment. Yet each has visited one, or will, or must, for all share the same need. The market is lively, yet beneath it runs the same quiet rhythm that carried you from the latrine, the rhythm of the body, the rhythm of daily life. Passing beyond the market, the streets narrow. Walls rise close on either side, shutting out the wider view. Here the air is cooler, touched by shade. You hear footsteps echo more clearly. A door closing softly, a murmur of voices from above. In these streets, too, the unseen systems of water and waste continue their work. Drains beneath the paving stones carry away the flow, unseen but constant, shaping the city as much as the walls and arches above. Even when you do not look for them, they are there, part of the fabric of life, part of the city's breath. At last, the doorway of home appears. Perhaps it is modest, a simple threshold marked by a wooden door. Perhaps it is larger, an entrance framed by stone, leading into a courtyard. Whatever its form, it is familiar. You pause for a moment before stepping inside, feeling the shift from public to private, from the open street to the enclosed space of dwelling. The latrine was communal, filled with voices and shared presence. Home is quieter, closer, shaped by the few who live within its walls. Inside, the air holds a different stillness. The sounds of the street fade, replaced by the softer rhythm of domestic life. A cup set on a table, the faint crackle of a fire, the rustle of fabric. The body relaxes here, freed from the eyes of strangers, settled into the comfort of routine. The visit to the latrine is behind you, yet its memory lingers, not as something to dwell upon, but as a simple thread in the weave of the day. Evening may be drawing closer now. The light softens, spreading gently across walls and floors. The air cools, and with it the sounds of the city shift, quieter, less hurried. The marketplace slows, doors close, voices lower. Within the house, lamps may be lit, their glow casting steady circles of light. The toilet, though far away, remains part of this scene, for without it the evening would not feel so calm, the body not so at ease. It is one of the unseen supports that hold the day together, one of the silent shapes that guide life's flow. As you sit within your home, perhaps you reflect for a moment. The latrine was not beautiful, not magnificent, yet it was necessary. Its stone benches, its flowing water, its sponge on a stick, these were not luxuries, but tools, simple instruments of daily life. Yet in their simplicity they carried weight. They allowed the city to grow, allowed people to live close together, allowed the rhythms of life to continue without pause. To walk away from the latrine is to carry with you not only the memory of one visit, but the awareness of countless others, the countless times the same journey was made, by strangers and neighbours alike. This reflection is not heavy, not troubling. It is quiet, almost soothing. To think of toilets is to think of sameness, of continuity, of the way life circles gently back to itself each day. The Roman latrine was one answer to this cycle, one form among many, yet it held the same meaning as all others. To care for the body, to create space for relief, to shape life around the ordinary. Night deepens, the city settles into stillness, though not silence. A dog barks distantly, a cart rattles over stones, a voice drifts briefly through the air before fading again. The stars emerge, faint above the roofs. Lamps flicker within houses, their glow spreading into courtyards and rooms. In the quiet of your own space, you prepare to rest. The visit to the latrine now far behind you, part of the day that has passed. Sleep gathers slowly, like the closing of shutters, like the dimming of lamps. The body is comfortable, the mind is calm. The toilet, once so present, now fades into memory, its role complete, its purpose fulfilled. Tomorrow, or another day, the walk will be made again, the stone benches sat upon again, the water flowed beneath again. But for now, the day is closing, and with it, the story of this visit. In this stillness, there is a kind of peace. To have spoken so long of toilets is to have spoken of life itself, of its rhythms, its necessities, its ordinariness. There is no grandeur here, no great drama, but rather the comfort of the simple, the steady, the shared. It is in these ordinary things that rest is found, in these quiet acts that continuity is shaped. So, you lie down, letting the quiet surround you, letting the slow rhythm of breath carry you towards sleep. The Roman latrine, the walk through the city, the return home, all are behind you now, softened by distance, held gently in memory. The night holds you, steady and calm. Good night.